I mean, I guess that can then bring us to sort of thinking about
Mhm.
really just the overarching reason for why we wanted to do this research, which
Right.
I think we've already started to hint at that, but even sort of, again, just sort of like talking about that a little bit more. I think part of what you were saying was this idea of comparing sort of these best places to work lists and sort of looking at what kind of
Yeah.
practices they have within their organizations that make them these best places to work, thinking about who is considered in that about when you're saying best places to work for who, and then also seeing if some of those practices align with, people who are actually doing EBI work in the real world and working with organizations to see if the things that they're seeing and the trends that they think the trends and the practices that they think might be most impactful are actually reflected in these organizations of best places to work, so that they consider people whose experiences are often pushed to the margins, like you said, people of color, women, etc., whatever additional identities you want to add on. Are there anything you'd like to add regarding sort of our motivation and the reason why we're doing this work?
No, I think you said it really well in this discussion of, yeah, these best places to work and what we're trying to understand about them as well as define about them. Or maybe the better way to say it is we're trying to determine what that definition should be in the future to be able to denote a place, a best place to work. How is that including everyone? And that really is the motivation behind this. I think additionally, what is important is this conversation, which you also have brought up, is the fact that there needs to be a larger conversation about how we actually are categorizing and denoting these type of things within lists or within marketing or within just talking about our own organization, right? What does it mean to have a DEI statement, and what does it mean to be on a best place to work, right? Does that actually mean anything about the experience that people have working for you? And that's where we're trying to use both qualitative and quantitative data to get those answers a little bit better, to get some clarity on that and continue the conversation. So I think that also what is important is what are those research questions we're trying to answer, right? So given now this why and what of where how we want to build impact in the world and share this information, how would you explain the focus of the research as far as where we're centering our questions and how we're engaging with people?
Yeah, so one of our questions is really just how are these sort of outcomes when they're talking about equity, belonging, and inclusion calculated when we're thinking about a best place to work? And so, in part, what we're doing with that is looking at some of those lists, like Comparably and Forbes and things like that, to see sort of who is included in these best places to work, but also sort of how are they calculating what it means to be a best place to work, and does that different? Some of these sites will also have, best places to work for women, best places to work for people of color. And so do those lists then differ based off of just the broad best places to work, or, is there overlap between those lists? And if so, what are these companies that are at the top of those lists? What kind of practices are they including within their organization that make it a best place to work? And so really just trying to get an understanding broadly in the world of like what that looks like, understanding if there are common themes or practices within those companies that we are seeing at the top, but also really just sort of understanding the calculations and the factors and the questions that people are asking that go into sort of these ranking lists that come out. And then that's also part of why we want to incorporate talking to people who do work regarding equity, belonging, and inclusion, because we want to know, are those even sort of, the right metrics that people should be looking at? Should you be looking at other things? Should we be doing an analysis of your policies themselves and how they support people who have marginalized identities? And that's part of the reason why we want to speak with professionals in the field who look at diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging as well, to see if they think that those practices and the measurements that these lists are using actually align with those best practices and things that they think really make a truly equitable and inclusive environment.
Very well
Do
said.
you want to speak to the other question that we have? I think that is
Yeah, I
probably a
think
little
that
bit
it
more in your
fits in
wheelhouse.
really well because part of that data set that we want to understand is to understand where or how, if there is a discussion around power dynamics and how those affect different employees within the space, within the organization. And so, again, in trying to understand how the questions are asked, how the data is collected, and how the determination is made, we want to understand very specifically in there if and where there should be a recognition of the power dynamics, the positionality that's happening within the company, and the relationship to the effect on specific identities, such as Black employees, female employees, transgender employees, neurodiverse employees, and so forth. So if it doesn't exist within that definition, or if we don't see that in any of the data set definitions and questions that are being asked, that is part of what we believe the discussion is, again, for professionals who are already doing this work within the spaces of DEI and EBI, to bring us some of that qualitative information to talk about how they see that being encouraged to be part of the conversation or the work that's happening within organizations, or how, when it is left out and it is ignored, we come up with a different definition of a best place to work, which is probably not inclusive of everyone, right? And is leaving out huge chunks of people. So it brings us back to exactly what you said really well, Keturah, which is, if it's a best place to work, for who, right? Who is this a best place to work for? And I think that that is the larger question we have around all of these lists that exist in the world right now, and all of the ways that we are able to label ourselves as an organization, and how the world can label us from the outside and see us. Additionally, one of the questions that we have within this research, as we've been gathering all of these different best place to work lists, is how often we find tech companies at the top of those lists. And yet, when we pull the data from across the nation over the last 3 to 4 years to look at any significant quantitative change that has happened in relationship to inclusion, belonging within tech industry, we see no change. We see no improvement. And the little improvements we see are usually around white women being promoted into higher levels of the organization. So those two pieces of data, the best places to work lists, where people are being told to go seek jobs and employment, and then the lists that tell us that DEI is still failing in tech, don't seem to line up. And so that's another place where we are significantly looking at that data and questioning, how are these lists being put together to tell us to go safely work in different places, when we see that actually tech is one of the spaces where we are failing at building inclusion and shifting the way that the work culture exists.
Yeah. And I think that that also makes me think about, again, when you are bringing in sort of the qualitative components, is really what sort of like drew me to like wanting to work with you, was this idea of using a more mixed method approach to understanding these things. Because again, like you said, we can see multiple sort of discrepant things possibly happening within the quantitative data of who is in these fields, who's represented, what quantifies a best place to work. But it really is sort of the conversation between the quantitative data and sort of the statistics of what we're seeing going on in the real world, and the qualitative data of talking to people within these organizations, talking with people who do work regarding equity, belonging, and inclusion, to understand some of the nuances of why, we're seeing those discrepancies. And I really think that that is sort of an interesting and really cool component to the research that we are doing, because we are trying to take a mixed method approach to sort of, again, seeing what's going on quantitatively with the statistics, with these best places to work, but also, engaging with professionals who are in these EBI spaces, and understanding their experiences with working with organizations, and also sort of the trends that they see in their work, to really understand those nuances, what sort of conditions are actually creating a best place to work, and for who. So.
Exactly. I also think the qualitative aspect is so important, not only to the questions that we're trying to answer, but to looking at data in general, because I think that is where we have this culture clash that we often can't get past, which is why our quantitative data is often not quite useful or not quite on the nose, right? It's not telling us everything that's happening. And I deeply believe that that's because in society we have a focus on not trusting individuals and not trusting what they tell us. And so I think where we will start to find more of the truth of what's happening in organizations that is positive and negative, where we will see that there's repair and proactive work versus harm happening, is when we start to realize and recognize where institutions, as well as perhaps list makers, right, that create more data for us, are bringing in the qualitative, are recognizing the qualitative, and actually hold that as important as they do the quantitative data, right? That the qualitative, or the personal narrative, the story, is real, and that we should believe that, we should want to hear that, and we should want to include that in our decision making. It should not just be a quantitative list that makes our decisions.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about trust again is really huge. And, we've had discussions about like within my own graduate training, just that there isn't a lot of, qualitative training and things like that. And a lot of it, I think, comes back to sort of what you're saying. But again, when we're studying these or looking at equity, belonging, inclusion, like it really centers around understanding the individual and, creating rapport and creating trust. And again, this idea of fostering, individuals and supporting individuals as a whole, which I think is really at
Right.
the root of equity, belonging, and inclusion, because, people aren't just, they aren't just people that come to work, they're whole individuals. And I think it's in the support of people as whole individuals that, you really are able to foster equity, belonging, and inclusion.